Hello guys, welcome back. Now today, we're going to be talking about Cam Barker, one of the biggest defensive busts in recent NHL memory. Now Cam Barker was selected 3rd overall as a defenseman in the 2004 draft, and you want to know who was ahead of him? Alex Ovechkin and Evgeny Malkin. And once you're picked behind those two guys, you have some pretty big expectations. Now looking back on the hype that he had, how exactly did he get that? The WHL was in 2002-2003, the year before his draft year. He played 64 games and 10 goals, 37 assists for 47 points as a defenseman, and was really fantastic. Those are fantastic numbers for a defenseman even now, and he really was dominating. In his draft year, he improved on that, had 69 games played, at 21 goals, 44 assists for 65 points, and again, was an offensive beast in the WHL. And if I was Chicago in that same situation, I'd want a player like him. He was big. I think he was like 6'2". He was a really good all-around defenseman in the WHL with a lot of offensive upside, as he already had shown. And the hype, I think, was there for sure, and I think it was well-deserved when he was drafted, of course, but he didn't improve too much on it after the WHL. In the WHL, after his draft during the 2004-2005 season, he played 52 games, had 15 goals, 33 assists for 48 points, pretty much around the same point production as his draft year. And then his last season in WHL was 2005-2006, where he played 26 games, had 5 goals, 13 assists for 18 points. He ended up being called up to the NHL for 1 game in that season and got 0 points. So he did get most of his experience in the WHL that season. And here is where you get to the AHL/NHL flip-flop. He started out that 2006-2007 season in the NHL with the Chicago Blackhawks. He played 35 games, had 1 goal, 7 assists for 8 points, and he was sent down to the AHL, where he played 34 games, had 5 goals, 10 assists for 15 points, and was a meh season for him as he didn't really perform and live up to expectations yet in the AHL. And he started out the 2007-2008 season in the AHL. He played 29 games, had 8 goals, 11 assists for 19 points, not bad at all. Then he finished out and rounded out that season with the NHL with the Chicago Blackhawks. He played 45 games, had 6 goals, 12 assists for 18 points, and not shown that offensive potential, that offensive powerhouse potential that he showed in the WHL, especially when he was drafted. And he starts at the 2008-2009 season with the AHL team, and this is his best year by far in the professional hockey leagues. He plays 7 games in the AHL to start out. He has 3 goals, 2 assists for 5 points. Very, very solid numbers from him. Then he gets called up to the NHL because, hey, the Chicago Blackhawks see him really developing in the AHL. Why not? So he gets called up to the NHL. He plays 68 games, had 6 goals, 34 assists for 40 points, and that would be the best season from him by far that he's ever had in the NHL. And the reason that he got that many points, and the reason that he was able to sustain that throughout that whole year, was just because of the Blackhawks situation at that point. As we'll see in the next couple of years with his career, the Blackhawks weren't that defensive powerhouse quite yet. They were still kind of forming that identity with them, and of course that season, 2009 season, was the season before they got to the Stanley Cup final and won the thing. So with Cam Barker, he got a lot better of an opportunity, especially on the power play. He got first-line minutes on the power play, and of course, he's a beast in the power play for any team that he played on. That was the one thing good one thing in the NHL that he was really good at was that power play time. But other than that, the defense was pretty crap. He was a pretty slow defenseman. But if he got that power play time, if he got those offensive starts, he could really perform. And in that 1 year, it was pretty much perfect for him. But of course, that 1 year was not sustainable over his career, as of course the rest of the career pretty much goes on a landslide after this. In the 2009-2010 season, he played 70 games in the NHL. He had 5 goals, 16 assists for 21 points, and at that point, he didn't get any power play time. And with the Chicago Blackhawks were on, of course, their cup run on the 2010 season, and they were looking like a much better team. Guys like Nicholas Hjalmarsson were really young and really showing great potential to the Chicago Blackhawks, and they were taking time away from guys like Cam Barker, and it seemed like he was getting excluded and being the odd guy out more times than not, and at that point, the Chicago Blackhawks really didn't need him. But in the 2009-2010 season, he was traded to the Minnesota Wild in what would end up being one of the worst trades in Minnesota Wild history. The Wild traded Kim Johnson, who ended up only playing 8 games for the Chicago Blackhawks that season. He was a restricted or UFA after that season, so he didn't rejoin the Chicago Blackhawks after that. But the big piece that ended up being really regretful for both Minnesota fans and their ownership, they traded Nick Leddy away in that deal as well to the Chicago Blackhawks, which was obviously one of the worst trade assets given up by the Minnesota Wild in their franchise history so far. And while he goes to Chicago and he ends up leaving to the New York Islanders because of cap restraints for the Chicago Chicago Blackhawks. It was still a terrible trade looking back on it for Minnesota. If they would have had Nick Leddy once again, and that decor would have been filthy right now. But right now, it was looking like one of the worst trades in Minnesota Wild history. Chicago Blackhawks obviously benefited from it before the New York Islanders came and took Leddy away from them as well. At this point, his career is on the decline. With the Minnesota Wild in the 2010-2011 season, that really showed the ugly head once again. He played 52 games with them that season and had only 5 points. He just was not performing. He was not getting the ice time that he really needed to succeed, and overall, Cam Barker was not looking like the player that he was drafted by, not even close. And after that season, the Minnesota Wild gave up on him as he went to free agency, and then the Edmonton Oilers picked him up for 2 years, and I'm pretty sure like 2.75 or something like that. But obviously, it was not the best deal looking back on it. He played the 2011-2012 season with the Edmonton Oilers. He had 25 games played, he had 2 goals, and was obviously not that great. And a couple years later, he gets a tryout for the Texas Stars AHL team, plays pretty decent, and then next year he gets signed by the Vancouver Canucks for pretty much a tryout. And while that contract wasn't really a tryout per se with the Vancouver Canucks, it was pretty much just what can you show us? What can you show us as a 3rd overall pick? And can you bring that talent back for the Vancouver Canucks? And let's just say that that never really happened. He played 14 games with the Vancouver Canucks. He had 2 assists and was okay, just not really an NHL caliber defenseman anymore. And of course, that 2012-2013 season with Vancouver Canucks would end up being his last in the NHL, at least so far. He might make a return, who knows, but with the Vancouver Canucks, that was his last hurrah, and it obviously was telling that he was obviously declining and not the caliber of NHL defenseman that we thought he was going to be, and not even close. As a 3rd overall defenseman, he had lots of hype as being a dynamic, two-way type guy that could bring lots of offense, as he showed in the WHL, and a lot of defense, and he just was never able to transition and never able to grow too much in the NHL. But despite that 40-point season, he just was never able to improve on that. Was never able to get the time that he needed to really succeed, and of course the development was not the greatest for him. I've heard that he was a slow defenseman. He was just not able to really adapt to NHL ice, and was never able really improve on what he had. And with the NHL, he had a 40-point season, which was very great for him, but it just seemed like that was an anomaly. That was the exception of an otherwise very, very disappointing career. Now, it's pretty easy to say, oh, the Chicago Blackhawks should have never picked Cam Barker 3rd overall, and yeah, it is pretty easy to say that, but with 65 points, 69 games as a defenseman in the WHL, it's hard not to pass on it. You can obviously see what the hype was. Obviously, it was misinformed, and obviously Cam Barker never turned out to be anything close to what he was projected at. But having a great season in the junior, having a great season in the WHL, I could see why he had that hype, and I could see why scouts were really, really passionate about him. Now, there's also another side of his career. He ended up playing 5 years after the fact of the NHL in the KHL with both the Astana Barli and the Bratislava Slovan. Again, excuse me for the pronunciations, but he ended up playing some solid years there. And while it was kind of representative of his NHL career somewhat, in the 2016 season, he ended up winning Defenseman of the Year in the KHL, which obviously looking back on it was just craziness. Good in that 2016 season, but other than that, there was really nothing quite like it. He had that one great year, and then it just pretty much was a drop-off. It pretty much was nothing after the fact, and, you know, it kind of translates to his NHL career where he had that one great season, he had some hype, and he just was never able to translate it into other NHL seasons, was never able to stay consistent. And I feel like that KHL career is kind of representative of what he did in the NHL too. Now, other than a Griffin Reinhart or Michael Dal-Colle, guys that we've talked about on the channel as well before, Cam Barker being a bust didn't affect the Chicago Blackhawks too much. I mean, they ended up being a 3-time Cup winner without him, and it's kind of surprising that having a 3rd overall pick, they didn't need him. They didn't have to have him be a success for them to be a success, and that's really, I think, good for the Chicago Blackhawks because they didn't need to rely on a lot of those picks. They didn't need to rely on Cam Barker, and while, of course, the disappointment was there, it would have been really, really interesting to see if he had kind of developed in that 3rd overall pick that Chicago picked him at. What would Chicago look like today? They probably would have looked like a much different team because he developed that quickly, and because he was a bust, it really shaped what the Chicago Blackhawks are right now, and it shaped really a lot of things in the NHL too. But with Cam Barker, it's so fascinating to see how some of these busts just shape the NHL and its future. We saw that with Griffin Reinhart, how it affected the New York Islanders somehow in a good way that he busted, and there's other reasons why, but with Cam Barker, some of these busts turning into busts is really some of the fascinating parts and how it shaped the league too. And of course, looking back on it, it obviously is not the best, being compared with Evgeny Malkin, Alex Ovechkin, and being number 3 Cam Barker. And that just, I looked back on the 2004 draft, I made a video about it, and I didn't even know who he was. I barely even knew who he was. So again, to be along Evgeny Malkin and Alex Ovechkin, he had serious hype as a defenseman in the WHL, and I think he did deserve that hype in his junior year. So for me, while he had that hype, he didn't live up to it. I could see why scouts wanted him, and I could see why scouts really thought he was a good idea at the time. And yes, while it is sad to see Cam Barker bust and him not turn into the player that he once was, there are busts in every single draft. It happens every single time. And unfortunately, Cam Barker just had to be that one guy. But again, it's certainly interesting to ask, what if he turned out to be something? What if he turned out to fulfill expectations with the Chicago Blackhawks? What would they look like today? It certainly would have been a lot different. If you enjoyed, make sure you like and subscribe. Tell me down below what you think of Cam Barker. What do you think of his career? What do you think of him having that draft talent and having that draft hype, drafted 3rd overall in 2004 NHL draft? And what do you think of his career since then? I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.